the slides here. I don't have. Let's see. Right.
That's cool.
And then if you want to put higher, because I see on YouTube that the question already. Yes. That's good. Right, everyone. I think we're almost everyone here, so we're getting started in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, Pilar. Get started with the video.
What would be like space?
Let's make sure that the audio is on. Let's make sure that the audio is on.
Welcome to the Brazil Seminar. This series of lectures
While they're showing the video, I'm sure that you watch this video. If not, it's posted on Courseworks. Just an introduction of what the course is about. And we're very glad to have you here. We started a couple of minutes with Professor Fishlow, who actually initiated this seminar. Thanks, Pilar. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome from New York City, Columbia University. It's a great pleasure to have you guys here. And we, as you probably know, for those of you who are following us on YouTube, this is the first time they're doing this, actually, using that platform. This seminar is part of a class, and the students here are mostly grad students that are majoring in international affairs, in public policy, public administration, and but we have students from different parts of the university as well. Today we have two very special guests. One's our speaker that I'm going to introduce her in a moment, and the other one is a surprise speaker that we're bringing to come back in the classroom. Today's session, we're going to talk about Wall Street's perception about Brazil and emerging markets. And I chose this topic because perceptions matter. in the sense that they guide decisions. Perceptions can help us infer to what extent there is an opportunity for investments. But overall, in particular, when you talk about Wall Street, we are also talking about a thermometer, in this assessment of the overall situation that sometimes we get a perspective is different when we are seeing things from the outside. And nothing better than having someone who's an insider, someone who's from Brazil, but can speak from this different point of view. Someone who's lived in Europe for many years and in Sao Paulo, who has spoken on this seminar several times. And it's a great pleasure to have with us Emy Shayo Cherman. Emy Shayo has been the JPMorgan Latin America equity strategist since 2017, and the Brazil equity strategist since 2008. Prior to that, Emy was a senior Latin American economist at Bear Stearns, and she was based on both in New York and Sao Paulo. She has been ranked as a top analyst in the Institutional Investor Latin America Survey every year since 2002, taking the first place for both Brazil and Latin America in 2020. Emy's works were focused on interaction between equity markets, macro policy arrangements, developments, and quantitative analysis, linking local expertise with JPMorgan's global footprint on research. Emy has a master's of international affairs here from CIPA and a BA in political science from Fordham. So she has this very strong connection with New York and with Colombia. And before I pass the word to Emy, I would like to just acknowledge the presence of Professor Albert Fishlow. As those of you who have been following us, Professor Fishlow is a professor emeritus here at Columbia. He, in fact, he launched the Brazil seminar several years ago, and it's a great honor for us to get Professor Fishlow back in the classroom talking about Brazil. All right, with that, without further ado, let me hand over to Emy. Emy, welcome back to the classroom, and welcome back to the Brazil seminar.
Sydney, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so happy to be talking to CIPA and to our friends at Columbia and at YouTube, but I'm especially happy with the surprise you brought, which is Professor Fishlow, who I know for a few decades, and he is an inspiration for anyone who likes Brazil, who studies Brazil, and who follows Brazil. So, Professor, thank you so much for being here. And I have to be careful with my comments to make sure I follow the things that we've spoke for so long, so many times. The first thing I want to say is that when I was sitting where you are sitting now, fellow students, I never thought about going to Wall Street. It's actually the last thing that I wanted. And I thought we were going to be neoliberal, and the Washington consensus was something that was terrible, and that Wall Street never cared about the social welfare of people, only about making money. But 20 years have passed, and I have shown this recognition. I was awarded. And today, what is very interesting to me is that the social aspect that I was critical of Wall Street 20 years ago is perhaps one of the most important aspects that both markets and also companies care about, which is the famous ESG. It's very difficult to incorporate this into how government thinks and how public policy is being done, especially in very unequal countries. But I'm happy to say that we are in the beginning of reconciling market and social interests. It's important to say also what was happening, that I do think that social aspects are the critical thing to understand Brazil, Latin America, and actually emerging markets. And what we have learned is that the region, after the pandemic especially, it's all about social, and the choices, they are becoming every day more difficult to make, both for the population and for the politicians. Why? Because today Latin America is poorer, is more unequal, there is more polarized, and there is more room for populism than any time that I can remember. And it's difficult to think how to deal with this, because on one hand, I still believe in some sort of neoliberalism, which is to me a word that is like from 20 years ago, that is not applied today, but that some sort of fiscal responsibility must be in place, meaning a smaller state that doesn't crowd out private investment. But on the other hand, also, you need to care for all of those who are left outside of the bubble, let's put it this way. Why is it, and this is just an introduction, I'm just going to talk soon about how we are thinking about Brazil in Wall Street and so on. I talked about smaller state. This is true pretty much everywhere in Latin America that I think of. There is not one country that is not into a situation where fiscal accounts, they are not in a very serious deficit, and that the state is fat, let's put it this way. And there is, in terms of economic terms, if you have loose fiscal policy, one needs to have a tight monetary policy, which is high interest rates. And this is why one of the reasons that I believe that a fiscal correction is needed all over in Latin America, because lower rates, they allow for more growth, for more people to have credit, for private investment to go higher, and for money to be put into basically productive investments. So we would never have seen the kind of startups that are happening in Brazil and in other places in Latin America. But Brazil is really amazing in terms of how the tech is developing here, if it was not, of course, for all this private investment and low rates that are allowing for all this to happen, okay? But let's go back a little bit in terms of Latin America and think a little bit what is happening, because the region as a whole has not grown above potential since 2014. And not only the region has not grown since 2014, but also what is believed to be potential GDP, which is basically the GDP rate that doesn't cause inflation, or, it leaves inflation at a regular level, has been declining as well. So we think at JPMorgan that the neutral rate of growth in Latin America today is the low of 2.3%. And since 2014, this has been coming down, and even so, we were unable to grow above potential. This year, of course, because we are having a huge rebound from the pandemic, Latin America is going to grow a little bit more. But what is happening since 2014 is that you had the end of the commodity super cycle, very strong dollar that led to depreciation of currencies in the region, higher inflation, and tighter monetary policy. So all that kind of suffocated economic growth, and the pandemic became a huge problem of that. I don't want to spend too much time in my initial remarks, but talking about how we at JPMorgan as a whole, we look at Brazil today. When we look at Brazil idiosyncratically, meaning by itself, it's not a pretty picture, okay? We have growth that has been and is being revised lower several times. So for this year, we expect Brazil to grow at around 5%, and for next year, below 1%, and this has been coming down. the consensus has also been revising GDP growth for Brazil lower for both this year and next. Second, we have inflation at double digit as we speak, pretty much. We haven't seen inflation at a double digit since 2015, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 16, early 16. And interest rates that are going higher. We are going to approach rates of 2 digits, which is also something that we have not seen in about 5 years. We are in a situation that the whole world has negative real interest rates, and Brazil is going to have the highest real interest rates in the world probably at the end of 2022, because we believe inflation is going to fall and rates are going to be higher. So there is nothing great really to talk about the idiosyncratic issues about Brazil and Latin America. Inequality has risen, growth has declined, inflation is higher everywhere, fiscal policy is having a huge trouble adjusting, and interest rates are going higher. What leads this is a problem, and the problem that we have seen in Chile just before the pandemic in October 2019, which was that the population became unhappy with I believe it was an increase in transportation prices, pretty much the same of what happened in Brazil in 2013. And it's something that has happened in Colombia just last year. And it's something that we need to monitor in the region, because if the region doesn't grow for so long, is something that could lead to not only this social protest and violence, but of course, populism being staying in place for longer, okay? And we are, of course, going to get to this part for Brazil. But having said all this in terms of idiosyncratic issues, the global situation could lead Brazil to a better place, okay? So what do I mean here? We are overweight Brazil within both Latin America and emerging markets when thinking about equity markets. Why so? A couple of reasons. Number one, we think that all the risks that are that we see today in the markets, they are kind of priced, okay? So what, for example? Number one, the prospects that the Fed is going to start tapering before the end of the year, and that interest rates in the US, they are going to start going up next year. Number two, that the Delta variant has already done its damage, mostly. And even though I think nobody knows anything about COVID until this day, it seems that the problem has been receding around the world. Number three, we do still expect a very large infrastructure package to come out of the US and fiscal stimulus in Europe, which could help to sustain a very high growth in terms of the global economy. Number four, which is something that I have still some doubts, in our view, inflation around the world is transitory and is about to peak. And last but not least, and perhaps the most important for Brazil, the problems coming out of China, they are probably being close to priced, and that the growth momentum in China should resume next year, okay? So we have at JPMorgan a positive view about the world. The third quarter brought several surprises. So the Delta variant slowed growth. We had more inflation. You have the issues on regulation in China. Iron ore prices, they came from 220 to 110, and this is super important for Brazil. But we think that all this is kind of price, and that it's time to take more risk in the market. And guess what? There is no riskier market than Brazil, okay? So this is why, in our view, Brazil, it's an interesting place to be allocated, at least from the short to medium run. Next is the question that the markets are cheap in Brazil, especially vis-a-vis equities. You have to think the equity markets, they are represented by companies, and the companies that are where most investors put their money on, they have survived a lot of things in Brazil. They are the crème de la crème, the best companies possibly that one can think of. And they've done great management in terms of their assets during the pandemic, during the last recession, which was 14-15. So companies, they are well equipped to face volatility. So, and the earnings, they are rising and they are very cheap. And last but not least, vis-a-vis the idiosyncratic risks that we have talked about, and there is nothing great to talk about Brazil at this moment locally. Just a couple of things. Number one, in terms of rates, which I think is the big problem for equity markets, nobody wants to invest on equities when interest rates are high. So it's much better to go with lesser risk in fixed income. So I think this is already pretty well priced. We have rates at 9% at the beginning of next year. They came out from 2%. And there is the question of elections. So those who don't want to invest in Brazil today, I don't want to invest in Brazil because elections are approaching. Let me tell you, today, 6th of October, is exactly 1 year to the election. And in Brazil, things tend to happen. Drastic things, they tend to happen. When we look today at the elections, it's an election that is led by President Bolsonaro on one hand and former President Lula on the other hand. They are the two leads. And when we look at the polls, there is no one who comes closer to being a competitive candidate. But guess what? We know this scenario already. It's priced. What we don't know is what kind of economic policy these people, they are going to put in place. So will Lula be the same Lula that we had in 2003, who was very market friendly and who did a huge fiscal adjustment? Or is Lula going to go more the leftist populist way? Is Bolsonaro gonna be more to the right in terms of his rhetoric and less in terms of his economic policy? We don't know either. But what is, I think, that is being very, very discounted is the possibility that a third candidate emerges in the poll. And I think it's too soon for us to know because there is no definition on who they will be. The population as a whole is not thinking about the election today. They are thinking about the price of food and gasoline. And the level of rejection of both Lula and Bolsonaro are extremely high. So to me, there is the possibility that we are actually going to have at least somewhat better news vis-a-vis the election as the process happens, because the bad news are already there. Everybody knows that this is an election between Lula and Bolsonaro. So the different is probably good. So I don't want to take more time. I think I touched upon the most important points. And I'm here for questions and to listen to Professor Fishlow also. Sidney, you are on mute. Or I don't know if you want to say something.
Absolutely. No, I think, well, we are ready to hand over to Professor Fishlow. Thanks so much, Emy. Like a brilliant overview of the context that we are facing in Brazil right now. And one takeaway maybe from your presentation is that Brazil is not going through a very positive moment, but you're very positive about Brazil. So, Professor Fishlow, once again, welcome back to the classroom. And what Amy provided was, I think, the more traditional view of Wall Street, with a lot of focus on facts and on the short term, on structural challenges. And at the same time, it's important to look at Brazil from maybe from a contextual perspective, as someone who, with your background, brings the academic depth and can think about the country in more on the long run. So, Professor Fishlow, to what extent this perspective, a long run perspective, conflicts or complements Emy's presentation.
Yes, well, let me first off congratulate Emy for making it possible for me to comment upon what she said. I think the problem with Brazil is a recurrent problem rather than one that is simply a Bolsonaro problem. It's a recurrent problem which goes back to the Great Depression, and it's the continuing struggle between those who believe that the government should do more to emphasize and create the growth that Brazil rightfully should have, and those on the other side which wish to believe more in the market. To some degree, that led to an economy that was very dependent on external cycles and led to variability depending upon the price of commodities. Brazil was always a great commodity exporter, and it really did not switch to manufacturers until much later than most countries. It simply was always regarded as very much behind Argentina, which was considered the real center of Latin America. And the notion of the government of Kubitschek was precisely to build up a great governmental basis in automobiles, in steel, in a variety of different activities that would serve to bring Brazil out of simply being a coffee state. And Brazil today is no longer a great coffee state. As we well know, Vietnam today is a larger source of coffee supply in a general sense than is Brazil. Brazil has made rather a commitment to agriculture, which is quite productive. And one should not lose sight of the fact that agriculture has been the single most productive sector in Brazil on a continuing basis since the 1970s. And it has been responsible for a great degree of the changes in the Brazilian structure. It has made possible the flow away from remaining in the agricultural sector and the new flow to the municipalities, which has been characteristic of Brazil. Now, the fundamental problem in Brazil is that you had big government as a result of large government expenditures. And Brazil turns out to have had low productivity in the industrial sector. So that the great problem in Brazil is productivity change in the industrial sector. That is difficult to do when you have government always intervening, making possible more subsidies that are hidden, more kinds of short-term benefits to enable new industries to start, more types of help that have been given to Brazil over the years on a continuing basis. Brazil is far from what it was. Brazil today is a very different country than it was before. The 1990s were really a critical decade in Brazil because what they showed was that you had to reverse the typical policies which led to continuing government deficits. You had, for the first time, to generate government surpluses as a way of assuring that there would be stability in Brazil and avoiding continuing inflation. That was extraordinarily helped by the fact that Brazil, for the first time, benefited from the large commodity shocks in the 2000s, which was exactly when Lula became president. Remember that when Lula became president, he had the problem in the first year of the lack of accumulated power in Brazil. Electric power was extraordinarily costly. There were attempts to make it available. The government intervened sharply and tried to control the matter. And you had all of this with the typical consequence of difficulties in employment that were associated with it. What happened in the period between 2003, 2004, and 2011 or 12 was that Brazil found for the first time petroleum. Brazil found petroleum offshore. And that was seen as a great bonus that was available. Secondly, the prices of the commodities had gone up, which meant the terms of trade of Brazil went up. That permitted national income to rise faster than national product. So you had circumstances where Brazil saw large investments beginning to flow into Brazil and into new industrial policy, which was the logic of Lula as his way of creating new industrialization. And new industrialization in Brazil meant automobiles. New industrialization in Brazil meant everybody had automobiles, so that when it became necessary for people to ration fuel, what you did, everybody used their second automobile during that time, leaving the first one at home. And you had all kinds of necessary intervention in the state that continued to grow over this interval, making it more difficult to deal with. When the Great Shock first came as a result of the United States having a breakdown of Wall Street, in 2007 and 2008, you had Brazil having a great problem and having for the first time a cycle that was quite large, in which you had income falling significantly in the case of Brazil. What you did to compensate, of course, was what you would expect. All kinds of subsidies, all kinds of expenditures, all kinds of expansions led by the government. So you wound up with an increase in the share of government, which went up in expenditure from something close to 20% in the early 90s, all the way up to 35% by the time that one was talking about that shock. And you had the accumulation of external debt as a way of financing it, right? So you had a return to the debt crisis from which Brazil had gotten out in the early 2000s. and had gotten free of the IMF and the restrictions that existed at that time. Now, the major problem at the moment in Brazil is that you have had a reduction in the price of petroleum from something that was close to 130 or even at peak $140 a barrel. Now it had fallen at its minimum to something closer to $15, $16 a barrel. And all of that great wealth wasn't really worth it. After all, nobody wanted to invest. You had the state investing. You had refineries, Petrobras receiving all kinds of money in order to make expansion at that time and to go out into new areas, etc. All right. Now we have the Lula period coming to an end just at the time when the great crisis in Brazil hits. And that crisis is the combination of Brazil being a great world power. Brazil, after all, has the World Cup, and after it, it has the Olympics. My God, and a combination that no country had had before. This was an opportunity to rebuild, reconstruct, spend all kinds of money, and for corruption to run rampant in the case of Brazil. In the course of running rampant, you had the whole problem of the
Mr. Fishlow, sorry for interrupting you. Yeah? Because unfortunately, we have a limited amount of time, and we want to stimulate interaction with the students, right?
Right, and let me come to a final point. The problem in Latin America today is populism. It's populism of Bolsonaro as well as populism of Lula. And the reason you have that kind of problem is because with populism, you can always try to get it from outside the country and always believe that inflation will never become self-propelling again. And that is the problem in Argentina. That is the same problem that is going on in the case of Colombia. It's the same problem. Venezuela is lost completely at the moment. And unless one sees this, in this fashion, one will not adequately understand it. Sorry.
Thanks so much, Professor. No, it's the way that you put it, like try to summarize Brazil's entire economic history of the past 70 years and getting to the point where we're right now really helps provide a context for the students who are not very familiar with Brazil, and also for those of us who follow Brazil to put things in context. And a couple of things that I think I see as a convergence between your perspective and Em's perspective is that there's a problem that recurrent. You mentioned the fiscal issue that Brazil is facing right now, and that used to be a problem in the past. Productivity, definitely, as Paul Krugman usually says, productivity is not everything in the short run, but it's everything in the long run. And so it is a problem that Brazil is still having to figure out. At the same time, we also believe that we understand that populism, as Emy also mentioned, it is one of the main short-term challenges for Brazil and for the entire region. And as we start coming back to the present context, I would like to bring Emy back on the screen. And Emy, I think as Professor Fishlow pointed out, like there's some challenge that we have faced not only in short run but throughout our history. At the same time, more recently, there are some new elements that create additional challenges. For example, COVID, right? So in JPMorgan's perspective, in your perspective, the interesting fact that some companies, the companies that survived, are in a much better position to perform well. How do you see Brazil as a whole coming out of the pandemic crisis as we start to see some changes right now?
Sydney, today is very difficult to dissociate the COVID from what is going to happen with the social benefits that the government gave to the population. So we are coming out of COVID. Today, it was announced that the state of São Paulo has about 80% of the adult population already vaccinated. So and Brazil today has more adults vaccinated, fully vaccinated than the US, and I believe Europe as well. So that's a huge achievement because we don't have anti-vax. The Datafolha polls shows that 94% of Brazilians, they actually want to get vaccinated. So I guess the president is like in the minority. Actually, he said he's going to be vaccinated, but that he's going to be the last one. And at the end of the day, the whole question of the exit of the COVID is not only of the illness, but also of the fiscal expenditure that the government did to sustain the country while we went through the pandemic. So last year, Brazil was one of the countries that spent the most to keep the economy and the population afloat. It was about 10% of GDP. This has continued to some degree this year. All these resources, they are quote unquote outside of the budgets and outside of the famous ceiling of spending. And the discussion today is what happens in September at the end of this month, actually at the end of this month, October, that we have the expiration of this emergency aid that was given to sustain the population for the pandemic. Is a new Bolsa Familia coming into place? Is another type of social program coming into place? How is it going to be financing? Where are the resources for this to be financed? Can this be financed within the fiscal rules that Brazil has today? So that's the big conundrum that the country has internally today, that it wants to do more. I think it needs to do more with the population, but the resources, they are not well distributed for what is needed. So not enough for the very poor population, not enough for health, for education, and what is there is not well spent. So this is like the fiscal choices, how the money is spent, who gets it, and who profits from it is what's going to define largely how the election is going to go, how the population is going to decide its future, and how, ultimately Brazil is going to come out of the pandemic.
Thanks, Amy. So we have time for a couple of questions from the students here in the classroom. Yeah, and whether you guys start here, just make sure to say your name and so that Andy can recognize your student. Jeremy.
Okay, hi there, Emy and Dr. Fishlow. Thanks for being here. My name is Joseph. It's a question for both of you, whoever wants to tackle it. It's not an easy one, so good luck. What do you see the role of the private sector in Latin America and perhaps Brazil specifically in tackling, not exacerbating issues related to socioeconomic inequality?
Well, it's a complex question. Probably we need another class just discuss this. But in a nutshell, let's start with Amy first. Any thoughts?
So I actually think that the private sector is doing a lot to tackle all of this. So you look at the question of the Amazon, that, you know, deforestation has been huge. Brazil has been criticized. We are in Instagram every day. Even Leo DiCaprio and Madonna are tweeting about the fires in the Amazon and so on. And it's been like the private sector who is raising awareness and is raising, like, you know, attention to this huge problem. And putting down, you know, some policies in place to allow for the Amazon to be more sustainable and so on. So I think that the private sector is not engaged enough, getting more engaged, okay? I don't think that the private sector does not even close to what we see in terms of philanthropy compared to the US. So not even close. I think the name of the richest person in Brazil should be in every building in Brazil, and it's like a none basically. So, you know, not citing many people, but I think the private sector is getting a lot more involved because, like I was talking to Professor Fishlow, we are Brazilians. We want to raise our families here, and it's getting pretty tough. Okay, so private sector involvement, super important. And we also see this in Congress, where more private citizens who are not professional politicians are engaging in politics to change our destiny.
Thank you. Other questions here? Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Ignacia. Thank you for being here. My question was about the position of Bolsonaro in deforestation and climate change. Like, how has this impacted the investment? Because I imagine that some sectors like this vision and some not, and also there's like values behind, because investments are also like they want to invest in something that they believe on. So how have you seen this?
Yeah, so this has been a problem. There has been several funds across the world that has put a letter saying that either the policy of the vis-a-vis the Amazon and the environment changes, or they are going to stop investing in Brazil. There is the free trade agreement between Mercosur and the European Union, which today is on hold, mostly on the discussion vis-a-vis environmental issues. So this was something that was it was discussed for 10 years. It was pre-signed. The signing was supposed to be happening quickly, and it's totally freezed at this moment. And I think Brazil is a strong candidate to be a country to receive sanctions, to be the first country to receive sanctions because of the environment. I think the situation can change and is kind of changing, but it's definitely an issue. It's not something that has gone unnoticed by the world as a whole.
And by the way, so our next class, we're going to have a former executive director of Greenpeace here, Marcelo Furtado, who's currently a Lemon scholar here at Columbia, who will be speaking specifically about the Amazon and climate change, which is in Brazil. Yes, we have a question here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Madeline. I had a question. I know that you mentioned the need for fiscal austerity in Brazil as sort of an ongoing challenge, but you also talked about recent protests in Chile and Colombia that were in large part responses to fiscal austerity measures. So just what do you think the feasibility is of being able to implement something like that in Brazil?
That is the tough question, okay, to me, because it's what I think is a little bit what Professor Fishlow said. It's been 70 years we are discussing how to do that. And no, we don't know what is the formula. I was writing like my introductions here for this class, and I said, what is the solution? I don't know. I think the solution is really, to start from scratch. Because what we have today is a budget that is 95% earmarked for things that are, that goes for who? For the judges, for the courts, for, a gigantic public sector. We have 6 million civil servants. So, I think this rebalance, we need to face changes. It's reforms, structural reforms at the bone of it. And I don't see this happening, to be honest with you. So I worry.
You get to say, Veronica?
Hi, my name is Veronica. I have a question about, when we were talking about the public sector becoming more involved to like stimulate growth and investment. So I'm curious, like both in your analysis, in your work, as well as, projecting out growth or decline. How does or if at all, does like illegal work or like the informal sector play a role, like illegal mining or illegal logging? Do you calculate that? Like, does that impact like your interest rates and your numbers in your job, and how so?
No. So I don't have a number of how much illegal mining represents of like in terms of GDP or so on. There is roughly the informal working population is about today 50% of the country, which is a lot. When Brazil was growing, that was about 40%, maybe 35% at its low. But the informal population is counted in the GDP numbers. It's just like these activities. They are not necessarily. When I say that the private sector invests, I gave the example, for example, of the startups. I gave the example, for example, of, for example, Lojas Renner, which is one big retailer here, or Magazine Luiza, expanding, opening new stores, looking for things to open in different regions than other than they are based, and not necessarily the illegal activities. I don't know if I answered correctly your question.
Yep.
Hi guys, my name is Matt. This could be for either of you, but Professor mentioned the government subsidy of manufacturing that was popular in the Lula regime and then Dilma after. Is that still, and the fact that that has been sort of a drag on the productivity of manufacturing, is that still happening right now in Brazil? Is that still popular, or has the government sort of gotten wise to that fact that it has a negative effect on productivity?
Professor Fishlow, your favorite topic. You're mute, Professor.
You occasionally see industrial growth increasing. But the problem with thinking that you finished the problem is the rate of savings of Brazil. The rate of savings, domestic savings as a percentage of GDP in Brazil runs now at around 16 to 17%. That is not enough in a country that has fallen apart in terms of the national infrastructure. That is, Brazil should be investing at around 23 to 24%. If it is serious about having a capability to take advantage of the natural resources of the country.
Professor, then Max.
I was sorry. Professor, do you think that it is fair with some countries to put all the populist regimes in the same basket or in the same pocket? Of course, Bolsonaro is a populist leader, but I don't see a lot of Brazilians leaving the country because Bolsonaro is there, not like what happened in Venezuela. And what happened in Argentina, what is happening in Argentina. I didn't see a lot of people really leaving United States, leaving from the United States when Trump was in power. So I think that from my perspective, it's not fair, but I would like to know, what do you think? And one precision, Mexico held the Olympics in 1968 and 2 World Cups, 2 FIFA World Cups. And I'm not from Mexico.
All right. So, Professor Fishlow, it's a question about populism. To what extent we have different ways of express populism, and is it fair to put all of them in the same basket?
I'm sorry, I just want to check with you, Sydney. You want me to talk about populism?
Yeah, now the question from Maximiliano was that you mentioned populism,
Yes.
and there are different ways of populism across the region.
Populism is popular in Latin America because the nature of democracy is not really as deep as one would like it to be. When you don't have a degree of real interaction and a sense of participation, you create this sense by indexing wages, by using little mechanisms to assure that you don't impinge on anyone or anything. And the society becomes very quickly dependent upon then access to credit, who runs the bank, who manages this, that, and the other. Argentina at the present time has an inflation rate which is close to 55% on an annual basis. That's not doable. That's not going to go back to zero. You're going to have, again, some kind of plan that will stop prices from going up and having government involved, and you're going to have all kinds of difficulties repeating again what has happened in the past. The major thing that is necessary in the case of Mexico and Brazil and Colombia is finding a route that provides continuity in the educational area for individuals to do better than their parents, to have the ability to get education for free and not have the rich kids get education by virtue of the private schooling they get and the high marks they get in the college entrance exam. And education is fundamental in this regard, and few countries have been able to make deep changes of the kind that South Korea was able to make, of the kind that Japan was able to make, the kind that cut through society and represented a state where at least you could rely on its honesty in order to be able to deal with the educational problem.
Thank you, Professor. And unfortunately, our time is up. So we always save a few minutes in the end of each session, taking advantage of the professional background of our speakers, for them to share a little bit about their trajectory. And Emy, you mentioned that you never thought about going to Wall Street, and then you found that Wall Street was a...
Wall Street came to me, basically. So I was at SIPA, and I was very close to graduating. I think in SIPA, you have so many people doing so many different things. I was completely confused on what I was gonna work. Sometimes I thought about working at the UN. Sometimes I thought I wanted to be a journalist. So I had absolutely no idea. And I started to interview. I interviewed at Forbes. I interviewed at Institutional Investor. I interviewed, and I ended up interviewing at a macro consultancy firm whose name was G7 Group. And it was in January 2009. And at that time, Brazil was the hotspot in the world, actually 1999. Brazil was the big hotspot because there was a series of crises taking place in emerging markets, first in Asia, then in Russia, and Brazil was in crisis and everybody wanted to know about it. So I was hired there and I loved suddenly what I was doing, which was macroeconomic research for Brazil. And I'm very nosy. I started to ask everybody around who was who in Brazil, and I met a lot of people, and I met Professor Fishlow. And then I noticed that I could be doing the same thing, making more money on Wall Street. So I crossed the street and went to Wall Street. And here I am, and I love my job. Every day I learn more. It's very challenging, because these days there are new aspects in terms of research. We have to know more about big data, more about factor investing. We have to learn about ESG. We have to learn about climate and so many other things. And it's fascinating to me. I rely a lot on my juniors today who have much more of an open mind to understand these new trends that are in place, but I'm very happy with my career and also with the JPMorgan. So here it is.
And I guess some of the students would like to follow your footsteps. So if you're in their shoes as a student, what could you be doing in order to prepare for a successful professional journey like you're having?
Read a lot, everything, not Facebook. Read opinions of the people who disagree with you. Be friends of people who disagree with you. Today, I think that this is becoming very difficult to do. People are not crossing the aisle, and without crossing the aisle, we are not going to have the view from the whole thing. So a lot of reading and a lot of networking. So that's mostly it.
Emy, thanks so much. And Professor Picho, it's a great pleasure to have you back. So let's put our hands for them.
Thanks, Professor. Thanks, Sydney.
Thanks, Emy.
Thanks, students. Good luck. Thank you so much.
for our panel on democracy in a couple of months. Amy, we hope to bring you back, hopefully at some point in New York and in the classroom. But in the meantime, we're very happy to have this virtual presentation. So
thank you so much. All the best. Thanks for the great questions, all of you. Bye-bye.
Right, so we are finishing the first part of the class here and transmission.
Ciao, professor.
And so we're going to the second part where it's only for the students here. Professor Fishlow, once again, thank you. And Pilar, who is managing the background and the technology here. Thanks for facilitating our work. For those of you online, I will be back very soon next week talking about climate change in the Amazon. Okay, guys, so we're gonna go for our second part of our session here. Professor Fishlow, bye. So we're just closing the Zoom here.